My first video on this channel was in January of 2022, and it was on the relics of St Cuthbert. By all means go and watch it, but the sound is dodgy, as many people have pointed out, as at that stage of things I didn't know what I was doing technically at all. I think things have improved a little bit since then. Anyway, in that first video I said that I would do a follow-up video on the collection of remarkable objects that were found in St Cuthbert's coffin, but then I never got round to doing so. So it's time to begin rectifying that, I think. In this video I want to focus on an object that spent quite some centuries of its long history in St Cuthbert's coffin beside his incorrupt body. I know I tend to overuse the word remarkable in my enthusiasm for all things old, but this object is truly remarkable and unique. It is the St Cuthbert Gospel of St John, or as it was once known, the Stonyhurst Gospel, now in the collection of the British Library, and it is a book that is 1400 years old and is the earliest complete bound book from Western Europe, and it is in astonishing condition. As the title suggests, it is a copy of the Gospel according to St John. This Gospel book, or so a late 12th century inscription on its flyleaf tells us, now partly erased by years of wear, was found lying at the head of St Cuthbert when his coffin was opened in Durham Cathedral in 1104. The coffin of Cuthbert was opened so that his relics could be translated to a brand new shrine behind Durham Cathedral's new high altar. As well as the inscription, the book's discovery is also mentioned in an anonymous contemporary account of Cuthbert's translation in 1104. The account tells us that when Prior Turgot and the monks of the cathedral priory opened the coffin of Cuthbert on the 29th of August 1104, and it took a while for them to develop the courage to do so as they were afraid, the first thing they saw was the St Cuthbert Gospel resting on a shelf by the saint's head. Now the book was already 400 years old by 1104, and the monks realised its great age and importance, but as they didn't know differently, they assumed that it was a personal possession of St Cuthbert's. In fact, they proclaimed that it was the very same gospel book that Cuthbert had read with Abbot Boysil when he'd first become a monk at Melrose Abbey in the middle of the 7th century. But as we will see, the book post-dates Cuthbert's death and is very much in the Italian style. The monks were really surprised by its condition, even in 1104, and said that its preservation was near on miraculous. Something about the conditions within the coffin in which Cuthbert was enshrined ensured not only that his remains were incorrupt, but preserved the book from harm too. The St Cuthbert Gospel was then enshrined by the monks as a relic of the saint in its very own reliquary, wrapped in 3 wallets of red leather, and it was very rarely handled. It was accorded the highest honour among the relics of St Cuthbert. Sometime in late 1153 or early 1154, the chronicler Reginald of Durham records that at a visit of Archbishop William Fitzherbert of York, who in time was canonised as a saint himself, the book was then brought out of its reliquary and placed on the high altar of the cathedral, and was then hung around the neck of Archbishop William by the Bishop of Durham, Hugh de Puiset. Archbishop William then sat during Mass with the book hanging around his neck, turning the pages and showing it off to his entourage. He even placed it around some of their necks too. The book's association with St Cuthbert gave it a sort of talismanic quality, and contact with it was believed to transfer something of the spiritual power of Cuthbert to those who touched and wore it. By the 14th century, the book was referred to as the Book of Boysil, the schoolmaster of St Cuthbert, and it was kept on the 3rd shelf of a little cupboard on the south side of St Cuthbert's shrine, between a casket that contained part of the vestment of St John the Baptist and another containing a fragment of one of Cuthbert's own vestments. How the St Cuthbert Gospel survived the English Reformation is still far from clear. The cathedral priory at Durham was dissolved by Henry VIII in 1539. The relics of St Cuthbert himself were of course reburied under his former shrine site. For more on that, watch my first video. And the other relics associated with him and with others were destroyed. It is known that several church papists, men who conformed outwardly to the Church of England but remained inwardly Catholics, removed books from the collection of Durham Cathedral to ensure their survival. One local family, the Tempests, collected many manuscripts from the cathedral library. Thank God they did, as they have survived as a consequence, and around 300 manuscripts from the medieval cathedral priory now remain. Some enlightened Protestant divines, including John Pilkington, the Archdeacon of Durham, also collected former monastic manuscripts. It is probable that either a church papist or an enlightened Protestant acquired the book and then sold it or gave it away to someone who would value it. The St Cuthbert Gospel of St John reappears again in Oxford in the early 17th century in the collection of an Oxford mathematician called Thomas Allen, a Fellow of Gloucester Hall. He was a man who probably had Catholic sympathies, for Gloucester Hall was a place that such men found congenial. We only know about the book's presence in his collection because James Ussher, who would go on to be Archbishop of Armagh, saw the book in Allen's collection and in his notes recorded the 12th century inscription referring to the 1104 discovery of the book. The trail then goes a bit cold, but Allen seems to have sold the book sometime before 1622, as by then it is no longer in his collection. The book resurfaces again in the middle of the 18th century, when at that point it is in the collection of the Earls of Lichfield at Ditchley Park in Oxfordshire. And it remained at Ditchley until the 1760s, when Lord Lichfield gave the Gospel book to Thomas Phillips, a Catholic priest who was living at Haythrop Park nearby, the seat of George Talbot, the 14th Earl of Shrewsbury, to whom he served as a domestic chaplain. And in June of 1769, Phillips then gives the book to the English Jesuit College at Liège. After a few decades on the continent, the book once again returns to England. Faced with the upheavals of the French Revolution, the English Jesuits moved to Stonyhurst in Lancashire and brought the Gospel book with them. The book then remained in the collection of Stonyhurst College until 1979, when it is put on loan to the British Library, who purchase it in 2011. It is quite a remarkable story. This treasured relic is a survivor. But what can the book itself tell us about the object's history? Was this really a book that belonged to St Cuthbert and his teacher St Boisil? Well, let's take a closer look both at the text and the binding, which give us vital clues as to the date and where the book was made. The book's binding is in an unparalleled state of preservation. No other book from this period still has its original binding. The leather on bindings tends to wear and perish over time, and it's not unusual for a book of this age to have had 5 or 6 bindings in the course of its history, or if an early binding survives in part, for that binding to have been extensively repaired. That is not the case with this. Not only is the binding intact, but there is no evidence of it ever being repaired beyond having new end papers, and it is in pristine condition. We can account for the surprising condition of the book by the way it was left unused and carefully preserved in those wallets of leather up to the Reformation, and one wonders if it remained in those wallets of leather way beyond the Reformation too. The book gives us a remarkable insight into the form and manufacture of books in this period. The binding is of a sort that is often termed Coptic, as it is most associated with the traditions of Egyptian Christians. What that means is that the individual gatherings or quires that make up the book are not sewn onto thick cords at the spine, but are sewn one on top of another in a continuous series of stitches. The covers themselves are very thin wooden boards. These boards and the spine have been covered with a dark red goat skin. Now, such skins were often tanned and dyed in sub-Saharan Africa, and the skin used to bind this book likely came from that region. There is some evidence that before this binding was made, the book was kept unbound for about 10 to 20 years. The most striking aspect of the book is the cover decoration to the front and the back. On the front, the cover of the book is divided into panels by raised bands, and in the centre is a square panel decorated with a raised interlacing pattern, and above and below that are two further rectangular panels, also decorated with tooled interlacing, and around all of this is a border and interlacing twist of 2 threads. When a book is bound, leather is applied to a volume while it is still damp, and that allows it to form properly around the boards. The raised bands that define the panel are formed from laying the damp leather and moulding it over cords. The central raised decoration seems to have been formed by placing a filler material under the leather and then applying to the damp leather with some pressure a wooden or a metal matrix or stamp. The other decorative bands, such as the interlace and border, are formed by pressing a bone tool into the damp leather, which leaves behind a permanent mark. The back cover is much simpler than the front. There is no raised decoration, but simply a geometric pattern in the form of 2 stylized crosses made with the bone tool. Colour has been applied to many of the tooled lines on both the front and the back covers. 2 shades of yellow and a grey-blue have been identified as orpiment and indigo. The colour does still adhere, but it is faded, but when original, the dark red leather with bright yellow and blue decoration would have been very striking indeed. The design has of course no parallels in book bindings, but it does in other art forms. The interlaced panels compare with insular illuminated manuscripts of the period, and the famous carpet pages you find in books such as the Lindisfarne Gospels and the Book of Durham, as well as in both sculpture and metalwork of the 8th and 9th centuries. The book is very small, and the text it contains is very straightforward. This is not a fancy illuminated manuscript such as the related Lindisfarne Gospels, which may also have spent time in Cuthbert's coffin. This is a simple, unadorned text, a workaday text. The script is a type that is known as uncial. This is the standard formal text used in books in the late antique and early modern periods. The style is continental, it is Italianate, and it was introduced into England through the influence of the Italian missionaries that came with St Augustine. A comparison of the text with another manuscript allows the production of the book to be tied down to a very specific location. The text used is identical to the uncial found in a manuscript called the Codex Amiatinus, which is a very large copy of the whole Vulgate Bible that is now in Florence. This particular codex we know to have been made in the monastery at Jarrow, Monkwearmouth, the monastery of the Venerable Bede, and it was one of 3 copies of the Vulgate commissioned by Abbot Ceolfrith in 692. The Codex Amiatinus was taken to Italy as a gift to Pope Gregory II, and there it has remained. It needs another video all of its own. Anyway, a paleographical comparison makes it pretty clear that the St Cuthbert Gospel was made in Jarrow, Monkwearmouth in the early 8th century by the same scribes that produced the Codex Amiatinus. Now the neat clincher for all of this that suggests that the binding too was made in Jarrow, Monkwearmouth is provided by a wonderful illuminated page in the Codex Amiatinus itself. It shows Ezra the scribe hard at work, and what do we see in the background but a bookcase stuffed full with bright red bound books, decorated not dissimilarly to the St Cuthbert Gospel. The scribe who painted this illustration of Ezra the scribe has placed Ezra in their own familiar surroundings, the scriptorium at Jarrow, Monkwearmouth. So the scholarly consensus is that the book dates from the early years of the 8th century and was written and bound at Jarrow, Monkwearmouth, and was completed somewhere between 700 and 730 AD. That does offer a tantalising possibility that the Venerable Bede, who died in 735, saw it, perhaps even handled it, and may have been involved in its production. However, that dating does present us with a bit of a problem in terms of the book's association with St Cuthbert, for Cuthbert died in 687. This book, placed in his coffin, cannot, therefore, have been his possession, nor, of course, as the medieval monks believed, the Book of Boisil. So why was the Gospel book in Cuthbert's coffin? The book would have been a very valuable possession for the monastery at Lindisfarne. Given that Jarrow Monkwearmouth had an accurate rendering of the Vulgate Bible, which was being used as a source for copying other texts, and that they had an active and busy scriptorium, it seems quite natural that the monks of Lindisfarne would order a text of the Gospels from them. When the Vikings invaded Lindisfarne in 875, the book was already old, but it was still valuable to the monks. The monks were forced to flee, and they picked up the coffin of Cuthbert and carried it with them, along with their most precious possessions. They probably placed the Gospel book in St Cuthbert's coffin as they travelled from place to place for safekeeping, a sensible precaution if it is to be protected from the inclement weather. Of course, for the next 125 years, the community of Lindisfarne did not have a permanent settled home. They settled for a time at Chester Street, where the community gradually evolved into a community of secular canons, and that was of course transplanted to Durham in 995, and they took Cuthbert with them. That community at Durham was replaced in 1083 by a Benedictine community that was taken out of the newly established monasteries at Monkwearmouth and Jarrow. So the true origin of the book likely became obscured over the centuries, and its continued presence in the coffin of the saint ensured that it became attached just by association with the name of St Cuthbert. Thanks very much for watching. The latest issue of the Antiquary magazine is now available. This month I visit Fotheringay, the mausoleum of the Royal House of York and the place where Mary Queen of Scots was executed. I explore in the issue the great events that took place in this sleepy English village. If you'd like a copy, go along to the website where individual copies are available and where you can subscribe to both print and digital issues.